Welcome everybody tonight at the book launch of The Chinese Dream. You probably took a look already at the book, which is in the back. You can buy it for a special price. So if you haven't looked at it, you can do that afterwards. Also, a warm welcome to all the people who are following the stream tonight. I know there's quite some people abroad who are following the stream. The book, The Chinese Dream, that will be presented tonight has been conceived by Neville Mars. Neville will do a presentation tonight, and has been produced by Neville and Adrian Hornsby, and it has been managed by Saskia Blanco. There is a long list of writers, if you look at the book, that have contributed to this book. And those are people from very diverse practices, you could say, from critics, designers, sociologists, urban planners, artists. And one of them is also here tonight, which is Martijn the Waal, who will also do a presentation. First of all, I would like to express my admiration actually for the book. I want to express my admiration for the whole body of work of Dynamic City Foundation that has led to this publication. And it has taken them about 4 years to get it done, and you can see in the size of the book that it has been very productive years that pass by. For those of you who are not familiar with Dynamic City Foundation, you can look it up online. Dynamic City Foundation is actually an international research and design platform investigating the rapidly changing urban environment in China. They made it their mission. When I first met Neville, which is in 2004, we were actually both taking our first steps into China. And Neville did it in a very radical way because he moved directly to Beijing. And he opened the Dynamic City Foundation office in Factory 798. Factory 798 is a former industrial complex in Beijing that is housed now by a lot of artists, small galleries, bookshops, but which is also rapidly changing, as the whole of China is rapidly changing. In 2004, V2 started a long-term collaboration with Tsinghua University, which is in Beijing. And from that, we built a network in China with a lot of independent art organizations, also some formal art organization, depending on who was in charge there, with universities spread over the main cities in China. In the meantime, this rich and diverse network has led to several forms of projects and collaborations, and diverse projects in the field of art, technology, and society. We stepped actually into a territory that in its social, political, and cultural development was and is undergoing tremendous changes. But to understand what is changing and how things are changing and who are the players in these changes is a complex matter. The book, The Chinese Dream, in that sense, for me, is a very valuable book because it opens up a lot of, the different aspects in this whole process of urbanization, which is the core, you could say, of the big transformations happening in China. So I'm really very glad that this presentation could be organized tonight, and I'm glad that so many people thought the same thing, because it's a nice filled room tonight. The book that is presented tonight will show you actually China in all its astonishing diversity, from the glitchiest megamalls to the gloomiest slums, and from the rural fringe to the mushrooming village. So I'm sure that many of you have also a lot of personal questions, because in the years that we did these projects in China, we got a lot of emails from all kind of people asking us, what the hell are you doing in China? Are you aware what's happening in China? Why are you interested in China? What is actually happening in China? So also in that respect, I think that this presentation is a very, for us at least, a very important one to do, to open up the doors much more and to get information exchanged into the networks. The program for tonight is divided in two sections, in two segments. The first part of the evening will be a presentation about the book, The Chinese Dream, by Neville Mars, who will start off. And after that, the researcher and curator Martijn de Waal will give a presentation. And the third speaker for tonight is Adrian Hornsby, an economic journalist. So after that, I'm hearing this heavy boom in between. After that, we're going to have a panel. That means that the microphone is open for the audience. Of course, you can ask direct questions after each presentation, but we try to, limit that a little bit to get everything more or less into the panel debate and to get some kind of dynamics going between the speakers and the audience tonight. So for tonight, we have a very good moderator who is following this project and part of this project since some time. His name is Louis Coulomb. He's a criticaster and energy policy specialist from the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge, and he will moderate the panel debate tonight. So I think I should hand the microphone to Louis. There he is. And he will introduce you to the speakers and guide you through this hopefully very exciting evening with, some hot debates. Louis, it's all yours.
I'm French. I'm a little bit shorter. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that thank you for the introduction, but I'm not an energy specialist at the Faculty of Economics. In fact, I'm an engineer in wind energy. But I followed Neville in his first steps in this great project. Some of you may know Neville. And so those of you that do will understand that it's rather difficult to put him in a nutshell. He's an architect, he's an urban planner, he's worked on documentaries, he's done art installations, all kinds of very interesting things. In fact, he may have mastered other disciplines over the last 4 years to bring to bear on the complex issues of China. So I'll give him the floor now. Just to note, the idea of tonight is to stimulate discussion. So if you have a question, make a mental note of it and put it to the speakers after the presentation. So between the presentation, there will be some time for questions. Neville?
Is this going to work? I think we still have an issue with this screen. There it is. Thank you very much. Louis gave us 25 minutes each. That's not much. Still, I want to take 1 minute first to thank V2 for hosting this event and inviting us over, and take another minute to explain the discussion you just mentioned. It's true. The very first person I pitched this project to is Alex. In 4 years, it's also been the only person who was dead serious in his response and didn't either start laughing or start walking out of the room and looking cynical. This support has continued from day one, and it's continuing today, and I'm very grateful for that. It's a pretty good description. It's a very broad and wide-ranged project, yet tonight I want to try and focus on the new cities aspect of it. This is how the story started 4.5 years ago, and that's what tonight maybe should be the core topic as we come almost full circle here in Rotterdam. The project started with a statement made online by the Minister of Civil Affairs of China, who said, let's build 400 new cities by the year 2020. I read that very short statement and immediately felt compelled to investigate. It was clear at that point already, this is probably not a real ambition. It seemed to me completely impossible. Yet China has produced the forces that made it necessary to launch such an ambitious statement. So 20 new cities each year of about 1 million people each, 400 cities. How can you manage that? How can you even start to think it? Is there a taxonomy? Is there a structure for such a project? We were insanely ambitious and started to map it out, building a taxonomy that pretty much covers everything. In hindsight, obviously not very effective. What was good was to try and connect what's going on in different scales and try and connect what's going on in different fields. This is what's crucial now today in China, where there's so little time to consider the future, where there's so little time to imagine an alternative reality. So a tension between manifesto and manifestation, between what we see is emerging physically in on a daily basis, cities growing pretty much out of nowhere, and the goals to design them, the ambition of giving quality to these new cities. In reality, in the West, the debate has been very lively of what we want our cities to be, but we have very little opportunity to create anything. This is pretty much the opposite. So moving our team there seemed a very sort of intuitive motion of bringing the ideas to where the action is. Action at a scale of the whole of Western Europe built in 20 years. So we started thinking right at the beginning, right at the basis. What kind of cities would this be? What could it be? What would we think is necessary it should be? The social aspects. Tonight we have a sort of a triptych. I want to talk about the ideology of these new cities. We will also hear about the social aspects and the economy of it. The social aspect, predominantly the fact that you're building cities for a new type of urbanization, a new type of urban inhabitant, migrants coming from the rural environments, moving to the cities. And the spatial aspect, which is sort of has been my own fascination. Can you build a city from scratch? Can you build a city on top of an existing city, which is happening? How do these manifestations occur? Next to the existing, on top, sprawling out of, etc. And then how can these ambitions be aligned with the global necessity to make cities that are more sustainable, energy efficient? Then there's a historic aspect of what would happen with the previous. Ultimately, you have a condition that can be divided in a sort of a doom or business as usual scenario and maybe an alternative path, a dream scenario. Because what many people seem to forget, we in the West, especially architects and planners, like to project our utopias on top of this seemingly endless and empty map of China. And the same goes for Chinese planners who treat existing cities as potential tabula rasa, just waiting to be demolished. In reality, China is halfway done. Since 1978, the open door policy, things have been booming, and we can roughly assume that there's another 30 years of progress. We are halfway. And this halfway marker requires a totally different approach, a much more, I will argue, organic approach. In any case, there's a lot to think about. The future of the city can be, and China proves must be, readdressed. We can start thinking from the very beginning, is the city man's greatest invention, or is it a mere byproduct of civilization? Before answering that, some general background. We all know where the action is when it comes to urban expansion, urbanization. It's at the moment in Asia, and it's going to be there for the next decades. If you look at China, roughly the size of Beijing is added each year. Beijing now 18 million plus. The forces behind that, still population growth, even though the one-child policy has been put in place and is still, though less and less strong, it's still in place. And secondly, a migration to the urban areas and an urbanization of the rural areas. And then dealing with numbers has been a particularly tricky business. There's very little to hold on to. There's very little solid ground when talking and thinking about China. This diagram shows, if you project all the ideas, the projections for 2020 next to each other of the population growth, they are so far apart, running around from 1.35 billion all the way to already today 2 billion. Very hard to put a finger on. These are all official statistics by fairly recognized bodies. So what we've done is made an overall average starting at 1.55 billion. That's the amount of people that is putting pressure on the urban space in China. Pressure that takes shape in expansion of floor space per capita, larger homes, more roads, more everything. And then a move within China. There is still today, both in the West and in Asia, this idea that migration is pretty linear, that migration is from the rural areas to the countryside, to the coast. In reality, it's multidirectional. It's going from everywhere to everywhere, from rural to rural, etc. It's also temporary. Rollover migration. People move to the cities, make their money, move back again. And all the policies in place today, we will argue in the book, are actually encouraging this temporary condition. If you look at top-down settlements, the government's incentives, high-tech development zones and such, are scattered and it makes sense, built fairly far outside of the urban cores. But also bottom-up is happening outside the urban cores. So even though there's a strong incentive to urbanize, in reality, the real urbanization is taking place below the radar. This diagram is maybe the best approximation we could come up with of what we've been calling scattered urban expansion. It mapped all the forces in place today that all contribute to this fragmentation, to this sort of completely new and radical form of urbanization. This is important because when thinking and talking about new cities, we have to acknowledge that a lot of new cities are occurring even though we can't pin them down. In fact, in China, the last 2.5 decades, about 23 new cities on average each year were produced. This is a trend that continued. Actually, today, the rate of urbanization is still very strong. But we can't count any new cities. The policies have been tweaked that officially there are no or sometimes one new city each year. This is because it's very expensive for China to acknowledge new cities. New cities come with rights for its citizens that cost money in terms of social welfare and such. The move, the real move, is taking place somewhere else. There's a fear that dominates the thinking and planning today, a fear of keeping migrants away from the larger cities. This is understandable if you think of the fact that just about any developing nation today is facing slums. China, as one of the biggest, or the biggest developing nation in the world, has officially no slums. The slums are happening just outside the periphery, outside the vision, below the radar. And this slum formation, or at least fragmented urbanization, is occurring on the smallest level of settlements, the smallest scale of cities. This is very unfortunate because these are also the least efficient in terms of space use. There is, however, a concentration. If you're talking about density, as sort of a sensible start for a project such as this, and you look at the map, you come to a conclusion that actually everything is happening on 1/3 of the map of China. Everything in terms of economy, agriculture, migration, road production, etc. 96% of what we have called everything in China happens on only this small area, what we've been calling the people's urbanity of China. That immediately demands us to rethink the average densities. This is the real urban China. This is an area that can compete with, for instance, Holland in terms of average density, compete with India, Bangladesh, the densest large areas in the world. And within that area, there's other competing forces. Historically, it's understandable that the richest agricultural lands producing the most food are also the areas that are expanding and urbanizing the fastest. These, if you sort of put these maps on top of each other, start competing immediately for space. So China, so eager to be independent, if you will, a global, well-connected fortress, is increasingly unable to be self-sustaining. And this urbanization wouldn't be so dramatic if it would happen in a really compact, streamlined form. We've mapped some possible scenarios. This, which I really like, is LA density. Not an unlikely scenario. There's a massive circle. We like using American references because of the scale of the country, and also the Chinese dream started off as a reference to the American dream, a dream based on individualization, consumer goods and consumption increasing, and a flight to the suburbs. In reality, it's not a nice clean circle, which is very unfortunate. It's a sort of splatter pattern, if you will. But in that splatter pattern, we can still trace a concentration within a concentration. We've mapped, did a similar exercise for the area, what we've been calling Jinghu, basically between Shanghai, Xi'an, and Beijing. That's this black area. There, the concentrations are really serious. In fact, they are equivalent to a mid-sized American town. The only difference, we're talking about 2 times the size of France. So one continuously urbanized region. A region, if you start zooming in, you understand that nobody has been able to acknowledge this massive migration internally and massive urbanization within this area. It's happening at a micro level. These are some random moments on the satellite image. If you look at this, the smallest level that Google Earth has to offer, you can see the villages literally growing together, patching together in an almost continuous fashion. At that point, we tried within the project to answer every research with one proposal. A proposal that ran along, let's say, a doom or a business as usual and a dream scenario. So if this is the current, where you can trace this sort of urban ridge in the center as the most dense area within Jinghu, you still have a decent amount of green space left. However, if we project the growth until 2020 along the business as usual scenario, this is all but gone. A sort of mush emerges. But the time is still available, even though, you know, over the period of time we wrote this book, 4.5 years, things have already changed as well. You can start using infrastructure, in this case a sort of a double loop, a train track on one hand and a sort of road network on the other, to start streamlining and condensifying this urbanization, creating a sort of a new metropolis. So our very first project forced us to rethink anything and everything we thought we knew about cities. We were looking for 400 new cities and somehow how to place them on the map of China, how to come up with a formula that allowed China to give direction to this ambitious plan. In reality, what we found was one true megalopolis of over 400 million people already today. That brings us closer to answering the question, is the city our greatest invention or a mere byproduct of civilization? A simple answer would be this. If you could redesign Beijing as it has done over the last 8 years, looking up to the Olympics, you could choose any of these density curves. You could say, well, I want to live in Berlin, or I want to recreate New York, or Shanghai, very dense, very nice, compact, fairly livable city. Or, well, nobody actually wants to live in Jakarta, but you could recreate these conditions. Beijing at hyperspeed reveals that this is an impossibility. It reveals, and it's kind of nice for researchers, that there's only two, in that sense, fairly easy to understand forces are predominantly at play: the government and the developer. And in China, these two parties are often the same. This is, at the end of the day, the reason that China has been able to grow so fast. Developer and government can be understood as two parties with one hat, one party with two hats, being able to switch sides almost instantly. So as we zoom in on the map that's emerging, and you have to warn me of my time, we can understand, for instance, the CBD in Beijing as this sort of checkmate real estate condition, where the government slices up areas and gives it to specific developers who then retreat and in perfect anonymity and seclusion build up this single lot, making sure nobody knows what's happening because the market forces are so fierce he could lose his project almost right there and then. What you get is that these plots are competing without knowing what the other is doing. So they could both be building parking lots or swimming pools is maybe the soup du jour. There's no connection, there's no balance. Zooming in further, the same can be said of the residential realm. Very, very bluntly, you could argue what's happening is that the previous communist era that produced all the 6-story walk-ups are simply being extruded today. So this is a project, it's hard to see, but a project of domino blocks which looks exactly like the residential block, which then, as the market takes over in China, are being extruded, and the dangers of these blocks tumbling over increases. So very slick, modern, fairly beautiful environments are being produced. At least slick in terms of they look and feel very smooth in reference to their predecessors. You have all the amenities you didn't have before, like some public park, parking, etc., running water. However, that almost takes away the opportunity for the Chinese consumer to address these critically. They look, feel, but as we're arguing, they really don't operate any differently than their predecessors. The result is a radically new form of urbanization. The patchwork of these insular moments can only be connected with highways. There's nothing that really holds it together. In fact, urbanization, the profession of urban planning, has been eradicated. The scale of architecture has been expanded to overtake urban planning just about altogether. On a social level, these gated communities have transformed Beijing from this completely communal map where everybody's living in the same context, earning the same amount or just about nothing, to a completely stratified environment of specific moments. This stratification even happens at block level and even within one single block. So slick cities look smooth but fail to operate in any efficient manner. Inaccessibility is increasing. Monosprawl, what we've been calling monosprawl, proliferation of monofunctional areas is taking place, and social lockdown. So you can understand current Beijing planning as moving people out and empty spaces in. If you're facing such a monstrous big city as Beijing with so much congestion, it's a very intuitive step to say, okay, we have to take the people out. The center is the densest, let's move them out to the suburbs. And then we're going to replace that with big arteries, plazas, and such. That's going to be the case for, we are in the dotted line now, for the expansion of Beijing over the next 12 years. Can we still take control over this process? It looks as though you're in control. 5 minutes. As though you're in control. As though you can design every detail in the Chinese city. Literally from the wall to the doorknob. But as you're patching these perfectly designed microcosms on the map, and you zoom out, looking at the larger structure, you see a much more organic entity forming. In reality, China is running after its own problem. It's post-planning. We suggested maybe there is a model that can be formulated that takes hold of this process and actually takes advantage of the fact that so many people are still moving to the suburbs. These migrants are then becoming the core of a new quality to give density and direction to these fragmented peripheral areas. This is possible if you understand density as very much a physical thing. Density has a place, it has a direction, it affects its environment and is affected by its environment. At that point, you can suggest, you can start shaping and coordinating, giving direction to this organic quality of density. And within the really modeled, if you look at the scattered urban planning map, really modeled context, we produced a really blunt model in response. A model that suggests dynamic density has to start giving a streamlined, compact quality at every level, from at the center, the metropolis, but equally all the way down to the smaller villages. This is obvious when you think about energy. A very old, recently updated, famous map showing the relation between the density of a city and its efficiency in terms of energy use. Atlanta being the least efficient, top left, and Hong Kong being almost the most efficient, bottom right. But it's important on so many other levels. The way the city works on a social level, and in that sense, the way the city produces a type of consumer, a type of citizen. We're suggesting you can actually, if you acknowledge that you can't stop or reduce the amount of consumption, you can try and create green consumers. This is a map of Beijing showing an environment that's been almost transformed overnight from a very fine grain hutong or small alley fabric into this mega artery. A sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because this was built at a time when there were almost no cars. Now this junction, with it every other junction in Beijing, is completely congested. So as we try and speed up and click through the slides, you see that Beijing has lost its quality as a residential environment. The real Beijing, in that sense, as we knew it, is gone. Instead, highways at a scale that you can really, you should understand it as suffocating the city. This is a model we built that reveals, if you only look at the ring roads, 2 to 6 in Beijing, and would wrap them around the Forbidden City at the exact same scale, you get this kind of a bowl. The red box in the center being the Forbidden City. At that point, it becomes clear that the city and road construction is in a permanent battle. Every time you want to expand the city and serve it with more roads, you need more urban service to serve these roads. It's a catch-22. So Beijing, the once beautiful, maybe best example of a monocentric city in the world with pure ring development, is now naturally moving to a polycentric model. And then in reality, the government suggests we want to aim for a polycentric model. We want to recreate that. That reality is there. This is a map of Beijing today. A map that shows that already 1/3 of the people is living far beyond any of the maps you can buy in any shop. It's living beyond the 6th ring in this almost amorphous object. If you then start projecting utopias on the map, such as the utopia of building the world's largest track-based infrastructure, rail and subway, if you look at it at the same scale of the existing map today, you see that these people can't be served. This is one example we introduce of how we have to start coming to terms with the city leading the way in its development, and we can only try and give direction as opposed to the other way around. That's one example of about 8 I wanted to present today, but I'm going to give the floor to the next speaker, which is Martijn de Waal. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Neville. Let's see if I can find my own presentation. Okay, thank you. I will not be talking about architecture so much today, but more about the social system in China. And as many of you who have been to China perhaps probably know, this is what China for the last 5 or 10 years has looked like. When you travel through the cities, you don't really see the cities that much because they're being constructed right now. And they're being filled in scaffolds, or they're being built behind fences. Yet at the same time, you already, if you look through the scaffolding, you can see some shapes emerging. And when Neville approached me to join this project, his question was, well, we're seeing all these new buildings and architecture and city planning emerging, but what about the society itself? What kind of a new China or a new idea of what a city is emerging? And that's what I would like to talk about today. This idea of the Chinese dream, the title of the book, a new mythology of what it is to be Chinese, what it means to live in China. And I will do that by looking at 4 different parts. I've called my presentation the city, the citizens, an astronaut, and the system. I will first have a look at what is this ideal city of the Chinese dream, how is it represented, how is it being talked about. The next step is what are the citizens, the people who live in the city, how are they experiencing these new cities, how are they looking upon the new cities that are being built. And then we'll make a small excursion from China to outer space, because I find the Chinese space program a very interesting metaphor to understand what's happening in China, but I'll come back to that later. And after that, we'll have a short look at what's happening with the whole system in China. And this is another one of those fences that I saw, I think, in Beijing. Behind this fence, a city is being built, and I'm not sure if you can really read it, but it says, "City full of vigor, place, realize the dream." So behind this fence, the Chinese dream is being built, and of course it's being built by these people who are migrant workers who've came into Beijing and who will probably never be able to afford the places that they're building. In the book, we have a glossary, and we've defined the Chinese dream as follows. It's an aspirational drive for individual prosperity within a modern urban setting. Consumer desire keyed into traditional family structures focuses on home and car ownership over political change. So this idea of the Chinese dream is the idea to live a comfortable middle-class life in a modern city or a modern suburb, as Neville has pointed out just now. We also came up with this extra definition from the perspective of the Communist Party. Of course, the dream is continuing assured Chinese Communist Party rule, preferably with moon landings. And of course, the idea is that this mythology of this Chinese dream, so this idea of having this middle-class life, is for a big part also the justification of the system, because they're promising that new and modern life to the people. That's also part of what the power of the Communist Party is based on. So let's have a look at the city, because this whole idea of having a city as a prosperous place, it's really quite new in China. If you look at all the propaganda from the era up to the beginning of the 1980s, there's hardly ever a city in sight. You always see a lot of industry, there is the countryside, there's infrastructure, bridges, roads, trains, etc. But there's hardly ever talk of a city, because the communists at that time, they didn't really like the city at all. For them, the city was a capitalist place, a place of consumption, and they wanted to build a country of factories for the workers. So there wasn't much attention for cities at all. And that didn't change until after the Cultural Revolution, end 1970s, begin 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping took power, and he started his politics of opening up and building cities that should or accelerate the Chinese economy. And these are some of the first examples of where we're seeing cities in propaganda material. These are all pictures from one-child family campaigns. This one is still an old one. You see there is a troop of people going into the countryside explaining about the one-child policy. But here already we see a happy woman with a child in a modern city. And this one is a mosaic that I saw in Shenzhen, a city just across the border from Hong Kong in the south of China. Again, it's promoting the one-child policy, and we're seeing a happy, modern dressed, modern, wealthy couple, but here we're seeing some skyscrapers and a big city. So this happy family belongs in the city, so to speak. Here are some other examples of propaganda from the early 80s. Still some references to the countryside with modern housing, and here the countryside has disappeared and it's only modern buildings. And this is a billboard that you find again in Shenzhen. This is Deng Xiaoping, and I think in the 90s you saw a lot of billboards like this. Again, the modern city with its skyscrapers and glass and steel towers, but very important, you see a political figure at the foreground, because it was his idea to actually build the city there. So the political party more or less willed that city into being. And almost we see him also overlooking the city, and he sees that it all was good. But if you look around China right now, you still see some of these billboards with the political leaders, but more and more you see a different kind of billboards. The political leaders have gone, and these are the billboards of the new China that is actually being built. These are the images being put up by the developers, and they show you beautiful apartments, modern architecture, often with luxurious names, and a lot of lifestyle aspects are stressed. You can live a beautiful, nice, comfortable life in a big apartment in the city. Here is another one in Beijing, and I found this somewhat metaphorical for this whole idea of the Chinese dream, because this is, of course, a city that it has not been built, but it's going to be built right there if the developer will get all the money and succeed in getting all the permits and everything. And here we see a bike repairman who is working there on the sidewalk, who is one of those Chinese who might be aspiring to one day live in one of those apartments. And if not he himself, because he's only a simple bicycle repairman, then maybe his children, if he's able to send them to university, they will one day be able to live in one of those apartments. And you see those images of a modern city with skyscrapers, high density, luxurious life. You don't only see it on project developers, billboards, but you see it in all kinds of aspects of culture in China right now. This is a building, a painting in Shanghai. I think it was a project done by a school who painted, again, on fences behind which was being built, their imaginations of the city. And this is the skyline of Shanghai, and again, there is astronauts in space. China is a modern country. And this is an advertisement for a bank. Also again, skyline, beautiful buildings, modern architecture, etc., etc. And this is a postcard that I bought in Shenzhen. And I think it's a very interesting postcard because it's a far step from the first images I showed you from the rural countryside. Of course, we still see the infrastructure. It reminds me a little bit of postcards I've seen from Rotterdam in the early 50s with the Hofplein centered on it. Again, the idea is we're modern countries, we're having modern infrastructure, but look at the city. It's almost post-industrial. There is not a single chimney inside anymore. It's all apartments, offices. The industry has almost vanished. And that's remarkable because Shenzhen was the first modern city in China, built in the 80s, and it became a big city because of the industry. A lot of investors went there and they set up a lot of factories. So a lot of our shoes and all the toys in the world are actually all made in this city. But at this point in time, they don't want to be an industrial city anymore. They want to make the next step. They want to become an information city. And this is a video, a promotion video of the city of Shenzhen, where they're showing off the city to prospective investors and people who live there. And again, you know, we're seeing the usual images of the modern buildings. And I will speed it up a little bit here. There's even a monorail, and there's also parks and golf courses, and there is some places for tradition, but not too much because Shenzhen is above all a young and energetic city. So the way the city is being sold to the Chinese people, investors, is a city where you can have fun, where you can dance on the beach, where you can have parties, where there are skateboarders. It's not a city where people are working hard or where a lot of industry is, but it's a fun place to be. And we'll speed it up. You can go shopping as well, which is also an important part. You can buy lots of stuff and eat in expensive restaurants. And life is almost like a vacation. And is there no industry at all? Yes, a little bit, but it's all high-tech industry right now. So, and these are some banners I found on the internet a few years ago. Again, the city is promoted as the city of joy. Shenzhen welcome you. And here they are going even over the top, represents too much splendors and wonders. This is a boundless ocean of joy. So the idea of the city that's being presented to the Chinese public is really a place where you can live a happy life, where couples live in apartments, where you can go to parks, where they can own a car, etc., etc., etc. But that idea, the way it's represented in all these places, is quite different from much of the China that it replaces, or that is actually still there. This is a picture taken in Suining, which is a little village in central Sichuan, and this is, I guess, your average Chinese village somewhere in the middle of China. And the street life that you see here is very different from the one that is being proposed in all the advertisements and the commercials. It's a little bit chaotic. There is a lot of informal economy on street level, little shops, people just selling stuff on the sidewalks. And in those other representations, you don't see that at all. I mean, it's all official economy, everything is regulated. It looks more like a shopping mall than like a street where people interact or where there is things going on. Yet this is the China that's disappearing, and that's being replaced by the imagery that we've been seeing now. And to our great surprise, because Neville and I and some other people of the team, we went to this village and we went to the planning office, and they showed us a video of how they wanted to remake this village, and it looks like this. So also here, in a little village, somewhere in the middle of the Sichuan province, which is not really the center of things, they're dreaming of building a city like the one we've seen in Shenzhen, with high-tech zones, with offices, and modern apartment buildings as well. So this is the image that's being put forward of the Chinese cities. But what about the people who live in there? Do they buy this? Do they really aspire to those images? And when I was in China doing research for the book, I talked, of course, with a lot of people, and I'll share some quotes with you to give you an idea. And I also show you some pictures of the people I talked to. The quotes and the people that you see in the pictures, they're not necessarily the same people. This is a couple in Shanghai taking an outing to a little temple. And this is a quote from somebody who lives in Shenzhen. And this was a young college graduate student who was very, very excited to be in Shenzhen. He said, "I was so excited when I landed at the airport. I felt the same way the Chinese who emigrated to America 100 years ago must have felt. Shenzhen is the city of liberty, the city of opportunity, and now I'm here." This whole idea of the modern Shenzhen as a modern city has become a mythology that people have been repeating and talking to each other all over China. And you see references to it in the literature in the early 90s, even in some villages in the middle of the country. The high schools are called Shenzhen High School because they hope that the people from that school will go to these cities. So he really had this excited feeling when he was coming. This is another person I met in Chongqing, but the quote is still about Shenzhen. And this guy said, what we want to do, our generation, we want to build up our country. That's the dream of all the young people in Shenzhen. We want to buy a car, an apartment, and raise a family. So I guess this is more or less the Chinese dream in a nutshell. And he went on and he said, we don't need a history here. We are creating it, and we are proud of it. That's our culture. So he said, it doesn't really matter that we're getting rid of all the old buildings that were here. We're creating history right now. And that's what we're proud of being part of. This is another family in Chongqing, and a young girl who's going to one of the better high schools over there and who's hoping to enter into one of the better universities as well. In there, I would say, I guess this is somewhat typical middle-class apartment right now in China. And I think it's also interesting because it's a combination of, on the one hand, modern furniture and design, and on the other hand, there are all kind of traditional feng shui elements that you see in the way that it's been decorated. And this girl said, we are very different from our parents. They always had to do what they were told by the Communist Party. They couldn't decide anything for themselves. We are different. We set our own goals. We want certain things and we work towards them. So not only is there this aspiration of having a comfortable life in a big city, but it's also being framed as something that's within reach if you just set your goals and you start working towards them. Of course, so far we've seen all middle-class people who are lucky to actually be able to take part of that. But what about this guy? He lives in this tent on the street in Beijing, and he lives in there with 12 other people from a small village. And they've come to Beijing to make the streets. And his colleagues are all working, but his duty today is to watch the tent and to cook food for them. And of course, in the big cities, there's millions of people like this who are actually building the city. And if you talk to them, then they often see themselves somewhat of a lost generation. They went through the Cultural Revolution. They didn't have any chances to develop themselves during that time. They don't really like all the modernization or the chances. They're not really buying into that myth of the Chinese dream, except that they're really hoping that for their children it will become a reality. This guy said, next year my son will go to university. But that's very expensive. Tuition is now, well, at the time I talked to him, 7,000 renminbi, so 700 euros almost a year. And he was only making 500 renminbi a month. So the tuition for his son would be more than his annual salary. So the solution was that his wife would go to a different city and work there and also make some money, and then they would put that together, and maybe the grandparents had some savings, and they would use all that money to put their kids through college, hopefully so that they would be able to be part of the Chinese dream. So now we're going to make a short excursion to outer space, because last week there was another example of the Chinese space program. They even made a space walk outside. And I think the space program gives an interesting view into another way of how this new mythology of the Chinese dream is being distributed, sold to the people. This guy is Yang Liwei. He was the first astronaut in China. He was put in space in 2003. And after that, he became a national hero, and there were all kinds of rally staged for him, where people shouted that they were very proud that China had an astronaut as well, and that they were a modern country, and his capsule went around the country so everybody could see it. And of course, the space program is just like the cities. It's a symbol that China is a modern country, it has a technology, it can compete with Russia and America, and it's a drive for nationalist proud. But it's more than that. The astronaut was presented in some ways as a traditional Chinese hero, a role model, like this guy, in the way he was photographed, the iconography. This is Lei Feng. He was a hero, probably an invented hero during the Chinese Civil War. And he's in all the history books, and all the Chinese children, they have to learn about him. And they don't only have to learn about him, but also from him. And the lesson they have to learn is, this is one of his quotes. He said, "I'm a screw that never rusts, sticking to the place where the party assigned me." So in other words, my own individual identity or wishes or whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's a collective, it's China that's really important, and I will do whatever the party or the country wants from me and where they need me. But then if we look at Yang Liwei, he also went around the country, and people came together in big football stadiums and they cheered him. And in Hong Kong, for example, he was there together with Jackie Chan, and I think 40 or 50,000 people showed up, and they sung a song. And he also had some lessons that people had to learn from him. But those lessons are very different from Lei Feng. The lesson that people have to learn from Yang Liwei, you could say, is this is one of his quotes. It says, "You must always believe that you will realize your dreams, even if they seem impossible." So that's a huge leap from this one guy who's saying, well, I will be doing whatever the party needs from me, wants from me. That's not what Yang Liwei said. He said, I became an astronaut because when I was a small boy, I wanted to become an astronaut. And then I always studied hard and always did my best. And finally, I was able to realize my dream. In other words, it's your own responsibility. Learn from my lesson, work hard, do your best, and the Chinese dream perhaps will be yours. And something else that was interesting happened as well at the same time. The space program wasn't only used in nation building and getting out lessons about this mythology, like the one I showed you, but it was also for the first time used in all sorts of commercial campaigns that made references to the space program. So this is a commercial for chewing gum, and here's one for mobile phones. So again, just like we saw in the city clip, or the film clip I showed you about Shenzhen, where a city is about having a fun, interesting consumer culture in a big city, where people take responsibilities. Also, the whole space program is being, well, one of the ways it's being framed is more or less in the same way. So that brings me to the fourth and last part of my presentation, because I started to wonder, I mean, if a society is somewhat changing from a collective system where people are more or less doing what they're being told, to a system where people actually are told to take responsibility, to shape their own lives, what does that mean for the system, for the whole political system, the way the country is run? Will all these people, if they learn that they have to take their own realize their own goals? Will they become more active? Will they demand more rights for themselves as well? Especially in a time when technology, with mobile phone, internet, SMS, etc., makes it easier for them than ever to express what their individual wishes are, to find others who share the same goals, to link up, to come into action. Could we expect something to be changing in the system, perhaps? And again, it really depends who you ask. These are some people I interviewed in Chengdu, and these are people who may have to make place for the Chinese dream of other people. They live in a small hutong in the middle of the city, and the house will be pretty soon, or probably by now, it's been bulldozed away to make room for the new apartment towers that I've been showing you earlier. And if you ask people like this how they feel about that, then they will probably tell you something like this quote is actually not actually from these people, but from some other people that I interviewed. And they say, well, you can't really do anything. Politics in China is something that just happens to you. They decide and there's nothing you can do. It's like Confucius said, you can't really control your circumstances. The only thing you can do is trying to make the best of it. But I was wondering, would people like these people, the upcoming middle classes, who were being told to think for themselves, to take their own lives in their hand, would they have the same attitude towards the government, towards the political system, as those other people, or was something maybe changing? And I talked with a lot more people, and one of them said, well, I don't like our government so much. They do not inform us very well. When we had the SARS epidemic, it was very hard to get real information, but now we have the internet. There we can find the truth, or at least we can find different angles to the truth. So this was one of the first conversations in which I sensed that perhaps something is changing. Perhaps new technologies are giving people some sort of sense that they can actually take their life into their own hands, and that maybe something was going to change because of the internet or the technologies. And we were continuing this conversation, but it was a girl I was talking to, she said, well, you Western people, you think too big. You always come up with human rights and all that. But for us in China, that is not the most important issue. For us, politics is not that important. We are much more interested in information for example, about food safety. Of course, a very recent theme that has come up over the last few weeks with the tainted milk scandal. But actually what she was saying was that, all these new technologies, it would already be really wonderful for us if we could use them to organize ourselves to get certain things done. She gave another example. She said, well, for instance, one of my friends, she bought a house from a developer, but when she actually got the keys, she discovered that the house didn't look like the one on the billboards at all. There was no swimming pool, there was no golf course, the roof leaked, etc., etc. But in China, in a situation like that, it's very hard to actually sue a developer, for instance, because the system, the commercial interests and the political interests and the judicial system, they're all very much interlinked. So even if you have actually right to do something and you will go to the court to appeal, then often they will send you away because they're so much interlinked with the commercial interests. But she said what happened there was that some of those people actually got together and they used communication technologies to organize themselves and to really, that way you're not just an individual who is approaching the court, but to create a pressure group and maybe do something about these unfair situations that you see all over China. I mean, all over China, people are being kicked out of their lands, or they're being promised all kinds of fees, but they've never been paid. And usually the ones that are involved in that get away with that. And she said, well, what you're seeing right now is actually for the first time that people in small groups are getting together and organizing themselves. And maybe this could be the start of something you could call a civil society. And this is an example of a website that has collected all sorts of examples of actually food poisoning. So all kind of products that had been tainted by some sort of poison or scandal or everything, just as a means of exchanging information, within society about events like this. But then I've talked to a lot of people about these issues, and there's really two views on what's going to happen next. I mean, there is one view are the optimists, and they're saying, look, I mean, we're seeing websites like these or other websites where people who are working towards a better environment are organizing themselves. There are some lawyers here and there who are picking up cases and who are really trying to go to the courts. So yes, something is changing in China. But there is also a lot of pessimists who are saying, well, I mean, these examples, how many of them are there? I mean, there are 3 or 4 or 5 in a country of 1.5 billion people, 1.2 billion people. It's really very small amount of examples that have been really successful in doing something like this. So it really depends who you ask, which way it's going, and perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion afterwards, because I think it's an interesting question. So I wanted to round it off with another photo that I found very symbolic for what I saw was happening in China. This was a photo that was taken by a photographer from the New York Times right after China lost the final of the Asian Cup football soccer in 2004. And what are we seeing? We're seeing, this is actually a commercial for, I always forget, is it Adidas or Nike? Adidas. Impossible is nothing. And that's pretty close to this myth of the Chinese dream and the way it's been represented by Yang Li Wei. You have to work towards your own dreams. And here is a very overjoyous, you could say almost too much joy, too much splendor, very enthusiastic people rushing forwards because they're embracing the new modernity, the new Chinese dream that is being sold to them. And they're very enthusiastic and they're really eager to go forward. But at that night, something happened because during the final, the referee gave Japan a penalty. Of course, he should never have done that, according to the Chinese, because it wasn't the fall. But anyways, the Chinese kicked the penalty in. Japan won the final, and this whole enthusiasm. Well, this is a soccer team, but the enthusiasm of the fans in the stadium, it turned around and it became a riot. And that's why you see the police and they're some sort of a, not very transparent, but there's some sort of a force, the powers who are trying to contain the enthusiasm of the crowds who maybe want more from their lives, but there's always also the danger that the crowds maybe turn angry when the Chinese dream that they've been, that's been sold to them doesn't really come out. Because, for many, of course, the Chinese dream is something that will happen in the future. So it leaves a lot of questions. What's going to happen? I mean, will people stay enthusiastic about the dream? Will they get disappointed? What will happen with people in power? Will they become more transparent because they have to open up information, in things like the current food crisis? Or will they try to keep things in tight control? And those are some questions perhaps interesting for the discussion later on. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Martijn, wil je nog even blijven? Thank you, Martijn, for your presentation. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'd like to take some questions from you and maybe ask one myself. I think you'll remember my sharp reaction when I left China 4 years ago and I left you guys in Chengdu. My feeling was that many of the changes that were occurring and the dream that they were pursuing was in many ways they were reconstructing a cliche of the West in a lot of ways. And it turned me off in a lot of ways, especially the consumption patterns and so on. How do you feel about that? Do you still see this? Is this growing? Do you even agree with me?
I think, well, for example, if you look at architecture, the early examples were really cheap copies of the West. A lot of the buildings that were actually being built, the architectural style, the Chinese themselves, they refer to it as Euro style, because it was sort of a pasted together Austrian columns and Roman curls and whatever, and some cheap imitations of Western architectural styles, and also the lifestyle aspects. But I think over the years they've become more sophisticated in a lot of these things. And if you look at, for example, the new town hall that's being built in Shenzhen right now, I don't really like it that much myself, the architecture, but the premise is very different from those first, because what you're seeing is actually a very modern building and it's very big, but the roof is inspired on a peacock. So it's somewhat curved like that. So the statement that's being made is, look, I mean, we're a modern country and we're having a very modern city hall, but this modernity will definitely be a Chinese modernity. And in the beginning, people really, you know, like the person in the book who I quote, who says, we don't need history, we are creating it. That's a very extreme one. I mean, there is also a lot of people right now who are actually starting to look for roots. And I'm seeing this actually more and more over the last few years. You see stories of, you know, people who've been working in Shanghai for 5 years, for example, at investment banks and making lots of money and really embracing the dream, and then they start to realize, it's somewhat empty, and they start looking for history and roots. So, I mean, I only had 25 minutes, so maybe my story was a little, you know, one-sided. But for everything I've shown, there's probably also a countercurrent going against it.
Yeah, I was wondering, because this is like something that puzzles me, because in the Western media there's always this kind of criticism of China, that there's no free media, there's no possibility of criticism, but as soon as like Western observers and Western journalists go to China, they seem to very much copy this kind of behavior of being very uncritical in their observations. They're far more interested in looking at the emergence of this kind of new middle class that is sort of embracing Western consumption patterns. But at the same time, I mean, you cannot ignore the fact that in China, this is where sort of the global working class is at, no? Where everything is being produced that is coming into the harbor here in Rotterdam. So I was wondering about that. How is this strange contradiction, no? That within sort of liberal theory, it's the middle class that will produce the contention. No? They will ultimately establish democracy. But I think it's very strange that we don't see any focus on the contention that is, for example, coming from Shenzhen, where, I mean, iPod City is one of the biggest factories in the world. No? There were like millions and millions of people working there under really, really fucked up working conditions. So I was wondering, why isn't in the Western perspective more attention for like these kind of contradictions within China's emergence, and like, do you know anything about sort of whether there is any contestation on that level?
Yeah, thanks for your remark. I'm not sure, because I've also come across a lot of stories on the lower class and people working in the factories, and I've been to some of the factories myself as well. And in the art, you see, for example, the Chinese art, there's a lot of criticism as well about this whole new consumer culture, and there's a lot of people who are photographing or making models of the migrant workers. From my own observations in Shenzhen, for example, where I visited a factory, it's a bit double, because well, in the factories is a lot of young girls working there, coming from the countryside, and the conditions under which they're working is really terrible. They're working 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. Of course, there is a lack of safety regulations and all that. Yet, if you talk with them, in the beginning, they're still very excited about being in the big city as well. So. In the beginning, they buy into this dream of the Chinese dream, that they really told you, like, and then I came to the city and I was amazed, and maybe they only have one free Sunday afternoon a month, but then they went to the shopping mall and they saw this amazing world that they could never dream of. I mean, that's the initial phase. But then when they get older, because they usually come there when they're 16 or 17, when they're older, 21 or 22, they usually are fired because the factory bosses, they prefer to have the young girls because they're more obedient. And then they see the other side of the system, and they become very much disappointed about this whole mythology of the Chinese dream. Many of them go back to the villages, try to do something there, or they get married, or do that. Another thing that I wanted to, because you mentioned one thing, you said that a lot of Western observers think that the middle class will eventually lead the way towards democracy. There's also a lot of theories who state the exact opposite, who's saying that no, the middle class is not going to bring democracy at all, because the middle class is actually really much working in collaboration with the Communist Party, because they want to protect their new wealth that they just have gained, and they're not interested in sharing it with all the other people that are there. But did that answer your question somewhat, or were you looking for something else?
Okay. In any case, let's, in the interest of sticking to the agenda, let's move on to the next speaker, and we'll have time afterwards during the panel discussion. Thank you, Martijn. Adrian.
Okay, I'll try and smash through this relatively fast because there are obviously lots of questions already brewing. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about the economy, which is a huge subject and many aspects to it. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about milk, which Martijn touched on briefly. I don't know how familiar people are with the milk scandal that came up recently, but just to fly through it. On July the 16th was the first point at which people became aware of something going on in Gansu. Then the Ministry of Health was aware that there were kidney stone problems among babies who were drinking the Sanlu milk. Then August the 2nd, Fonterra, which was a New Zealand company, which was a major shareholder in Sanlu, learned of the problem and started to try and suggest that the province should do something about it. Nothing happened. Well, there was a silent recall, but no public recall. And then August the 8th, which is the important moment, was the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games. And that followed smoothly all the way through. There was nothing in the press. Nobody talked about it at all. But on September the 1st, the Ministry of Health concluded that the powder was indeed the cause of the problem. On September the 8th, the New Zealand government started complaining to the Chinese authorities. And then on the 11th, and finally, Sanlu announced a public recall, and on the 13th, the Ministry of Health got involved. And so, we see there's a good kind of 2 months going on between the actual suggestion that there's a problem and anything coming through. And, like we talk about SARS, for example. I think SARS was 2003, when, everyone thought that there was going to be this internet explosion that was going to change the way in which things were happening. But, this is a very recent event, and, the fallout so far has been 6,000 infants reported ill and 4 reported dead. Obviously, the reports are not necessarily to be trusted. And, the milk scandal is one in a long line of scandals. I don't want to talk about the scandals too much, but there's obviously been the poisonous baby pajamas, the peeling lead paint on the toys. It kind of seems too bad that the babies keep getting hit up in a one-child policy environment. Then there's also been the melamine with the dog food, the melamine in the toothpaste, then all of the fake pharmaceuticals, antibiotics with nothing in them, and antibiotics even worse with 10% antibiotics in them. And you start wondering, and for me this milk thing was I had a slight kind of click moment. It seemed to be so far wrong that I kind of became aware that, maybe how has this country got to the point in which it's got so badly off course? And even the most cynical analysis would say that there's a huge damage to the brand value of China through these kinds of events. Anyway, so as a way to start kind of approaching how China's got into the situation, then I want to flip back quickly 20 years ago. There was an enormous change. It was, probably the greatest change that ever occurred in the world, when the Soviet Union collapsed and China started really opening up the period of the export processing zones. And in a very short period of time, then the labor force almost doubled. Like 1 billion new workers came on stream in the global labor force. What we call now the global labor force used to be just the Western economies which were trading. And when they did so, they didn't bring on a lot more capital. And as a result, then the capital to labor ratio dropped to about 55 to 60% of what it was before. And suddenly there was the greatest ever opportunity for labor arbitrage that the world had ever seen. Labor arbitrage basically means that there's a differential in the pricing in the markets. And what you could do as a company was that you could pay the Chinese worker one thing to make the product, and then you could sell it to the US consumer at another kind of price. And the split was so huge that people could make a lot of money out of this. And the great company that was fantastic at this was Walmart. And Walmart last year had revenues of $379 billion. I mean, it's really a lot. It's the #1 company in the world. And we're in a country would actually be number 30 by GDP. It just pips Belgium. And so, you kind of think, well, Walmart has achieved this kind of amazing thing for itself. And it achieved amazing things for the West. The gradient in the arbitrage was so steep that Walmart was able to slash prices massively in the West as well. So people in the West enjoyed what over the last 20 years has been a period of continuous, almost continuous global expansion with very low inflation. The inflation was kept low by the fact that the Chinese workers were producing things so cheap. And we all had like the $2 t-shirts, the $15 TVs, the $80 sofas. In the UK, certainly, there's been a knock-on in that burglary rates have actually crashed because of the fact that there's nothing worth stealing in homes anymore. People used to go in and steal a video player, but now it's not worth anything. What can you sell a DVD player for these days if it's stolen? And so the West kind of enjoyed this terrific period. There was a sneeze with the dot-com boom, but apart from that, until now, we did very, very nicely out of it. And then at the same time, Africa in the last 10 years has had, particularly the areas which have had resources have enjoyed high commodity prices because of the fact that China's been using up so much resources. Recently, China promised 12 billion investment into the Congo, which has been rated by Goldman Sachs as the worst place in the world, bar none, to do business. And yet, the business is going in, even into the Congo. It's getting growth rates up at sort of 5-6%. And of course, the other people who've done well out of this, the whole labor debate is a big one. I don't want to touch on it right now. But the Chinese workers have been lifted out of poverty. So 200 million people have risen above the $1 a day poverty line. And essentially, in broad terms, the way in which people managed to keep coming to these factories is because the levels of indigence that were existent in the agricultural areas previously were so awful, and it was literal starvation aspects, and people would urbanize, come out of very low productivity agricultural environments and come into the urban environments and start working and producing growth and producing money. And this has been the sort of, the lowest hanging fruit, the sort of manufacturing end of things. And the problem with the manufacturing is, what's known as the Barbie conundrum, where the Chinese manage to manufacture the Barbie and they get $1 out of it, and then it goes back to the US where it's sold for $10 and $9 stay in the US. And so in terms of China's, moving on to the next level, and this is certainly part of the whole notion of halfway through, 30 years into the growth plan, and another 30 years China will be bigger than the US. We have to kind of change the way in which we're doing things in China and develop not only the manufacturing aspect, which is obviously the least sophisticated part of global capitalism. If we're really going to become global capitalists, then we have to get a hold of the consumption part as well, which has driven this move from the Mao to Mall, as it's commonly looked at. And it's something that everybody's sort of familiar with as an idea, but it is actually really profound in terms of what it's doing to the change that's suggested by society. I mean, Martijn kind of talked a little bit about what it used to be a Chinese citizen. You thought that your ultimate idea was to strengthen the Chinese state, and now being a good Chinese citizen is to buy stuff that you want. And it's a very different way of looking at things. And we have the Mao over here, and then here again we have Deng Xiaoping, and he's holding up his hand and saying, yes, the mall is good, come in. The thing which is great about this picture is, of course, even in the picture of Deng Xiaoping, there's a shopping mall behind him right here, inside the shopping mall. And so it's doubly good to be shopping in China, and this is the way in which people want things to be going. Certainly economists for the last 10 years have been groaning, saying, China, come on, you've got to develop your consumer market a little bit better. And it's been absolutely exploding. This graph shows retail sales. It's actually particularly astonishing because it's not retail sales, it's percentage growth in retail sales year on year. And so if we look at the early part of the graph in 2002, then retail sales in China were rising by 10% every year. And then, by 2004, it was 15% growth every year, and then by 2007, we're looking at 20% growth every year. And so the rate at which it's growing is growing. It's kind of exploding faster and faster, the consumer market. And everybody is extremely excited about the prospect of this because, of course, with China coming into the global capitalist economy, and it's unlike Japan and unlike South Korea in this, it's actually offering a huge new consumer base. The number of consumers that China is potentially putting on into the product area is much, much bigger than South Korea or Singapore ever had to offer. And this is, what's fueling this notion that, there's a huge consumer boom waiting in China, and, particularly now that growth is slowing down in the West, everyone's looking to it. In this slide, then, we see over here the young Bill Gates back in 1980, just after Microsoft got its first deal with IBM. And Gates' vision for the US explicitly was, we'll have a PC on every desk and in every home. And that was visionary at the time. That was a kind of extraordinary idea. And now in 2008, then we've got Bill Amelio. We can see how much more stylish computer guys have got since Bill Gates. And he's hugging, Bill Amelio is the CEO of Lenovo, and here he is with the chair, and he's whispering through the chair's ear. It took 25 years for the PC to get to the first billion customers. The next billion should take 7. And he's talking about emerging markets in general, but massively it's actually talking about being able to sell that number of computers in China. And so all of the brands, all of the global brands are very excited to sell in China. All of the foreign brands have explicitly declared that China is their target market for the next 10 years. And so, we get the second version of the Barbie conundrum if all of the foreign brands moved in, where the Chinese, maybe they're getting $1 out of manufacturing, maybe if it's being bought in China, they'll get another $1 from distribution and point of sale. If the Barbie's bought in the Carrefour in Beijing, though, then the French get the $3, and the US, because they hold on to the brand, still get 5. And so what we have to, what the Chinese explicitly want to do is develop their own brands. And this is obviously, beyond the consumers, we've got to get the Chinese brands going. How are we going to get the Chinese brands going? And what are the big Chinese companies? What's the Walmart of China? And so what this slide shows is the top 29 companies top 29 Chinese companies, and these are in the Fortune 500. And so China has 29 companies now in the biggest 500 companies in the world, which is, it's not bad. And if we start looking at a few of the first ones, so it's Sinopec, which is a huge state Chinese oil firm. Then there's the China State Grid, the China National Petroleum, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, China Mobile, China Life, and it's like China is in every single thing. And so, I don't want to read through all of them, but you can see these are the China ones, and it's like, wow, half the list, well, no, the vast majority of the list are Chinese state companies. But you can think, well, okay, there are a couple of ones which aren't. Like down at the bottom here, at number 26, we've got Jardine Matheson. And then you look across at where it's based, and it's Hong Kong. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Well, who's based in Hong Kong? So I made them pink. And, you can see what's happening here is that, if the 29 companies, then, most of them are Chinese state-owned companies, and then the ones which aren't are in Hong Kong. And these ones all preceded the opening era. They were all founded, under the British era. Jardine Matheson in particular, hilariously, was founded by a Scot in the beginning of the 19th century, just when the British were first beginning to take an interest in China and getting their concession territories. And so, there's this problem that why is it that, the Chinese companies, there's this heavy state hand that seems to be going on in all of the big companies. And of course, this isn't so in America. If you look at the American companies, then places like Walmart and McDonald's and Starbucks and Microsoft, all of these places, at one point they were startups and they were family businesses, and then they grew and grew and grew. Whereas, all of these Chinese ones are these kind of Goliath state-owned enterprises, and they're all being bankrolled by state-owned banks, and they're all part of this notion of socialism with Chinese characteristics, or state capitalism, or bureaucratic capitalism, which is something which, I think the rest of the capitalist world is having a problem understanding as an idea. What quite does it mean to be a state-owned enterprise? And people are very suspicious. And there are a couple of very simple and, well-known examples. CNOOC, which is, it's down here, it's number 23, the China National Offshore Oil Company, tried to buy Unocal in 2005, an American oil firm. And Congress blocked it. They said, this is not an explicit for-profit company. It's shady, it's opaque, we're not quite sure what it's after. We don't want it to start taking a stake in our oil reserves. And then on the natural resources front, this year, Chinese mining firms, again, the Chinese mining firms are all in that 29 list, were trying to buy up oil reserves in Australia. And Australia noticed that what it seemed that the state-owned enterprises were doing was they were selling the ores at well below market prices back to China. So the state-owned enterprises were taking a huge loss on this, and they're price gouging the ores, in an unprofitable fashion, because they could pay less taxes on Australia by shipping it out at the lower price. And then once in China, then other state-owned enterprises could do the smelting and put it into the cabling for all of their new cities. And so again, it's not really an explicit private business, and it's not a business which the Australian government felt that it wanted to allow the continuing purchase of mines. Lenovo, which again was one of the Hong Kong companies, but again, it's very embroiled in the government in China, and the government seems to get into everything. And after they did take over IBM in 2005, and they didn't take over IBM just sold the PC part to Lenovo, which they weren't that keen on. And Lenovo bought it for the brand value. But as soon as they did that, then the US withdrew their contract from IBM for the supply of PCs to their embassies and government departments, because they were worried that if a Chinese state-owned, well, a Chinese company which was too embroiled with the state was making their computers, then they'd be easier to hack, and there's a possibility of IT warfare and so forth. And so, all of this is part of the background to this kind of haze about, it's kind of like global concern about, what is a state-owned enterprise, what is socialism with Chinese characteristics, and, kind of what is a Chinese characteristic for an economist or for a company. And this is the point at which it starts becoming difficult to think about because of the fact that these companies are so opaque and the whole system is so opaque. And it's defined, well, kind of like a way in which people talk about it is that it's federalism comes in at every level above cottage industry. And you kind of wonder, how that happens. The state is involved everything above cottage industry level, and yet there's a lack of a clear regulatory framework, and there's a lack of a obvious rule of law, and there's a lack of a strong central control, which means that, and the lack of strong central control is an important part of the reform era, that instead of having central planning, then state officials, local state officials were given much greater control over what was going to happen. They were allowed to run things in such a way that would maximize economic growth. And so these local officials start to wield these enormous amounts of power, which is devolved to them from the central government. But they're operating in a largely lawless framework, which means that it's very effective for the low-hanging fruit. It's been terrific for these state officials who team up with private developers. It's something that Neville talked about, the relationship between the local officials and the local developers, and they'll requisition land, they'll move out farmers, they'll build a factory, the factory will make things for super cheap prices. And on that level, that sort of initial part of the economic growth is doing very well. But what it's produced now is a situation where you have this enormous rabble of these companies, or local provincial officials who are championing their own local hero companies. And they're not merging in the way that in the West, a lot of these smaller, you wouldn't have 2,000 coal mining companies in the West because they'd start to merge and technologies would be shared, it would become more efficient. In China, then each organization will have its local official championing it, and they're all struggling to undercut each other. Each one holds on to itself and is entering a warfare with the surrounding companies, and they undercut each other in terms of costs, and they undercut each other in terms of standards. And this is how we come back round to the milk situation. You start to understand how is it that you get to the situation where the quality is so low because of the fact that there are all of these firms competing on these extremely, opaque playing fields. And the thing which is so striking about the milk situation, which is what I highlighted in this slide, is the fact that when the Ministry of Health held a conference and declared an emergency, then it found melamine not just in the one brand, the Sanlu, which was identified as causing the problem, but actually in 21 brands of milk. Like all of the milk all of the baby milk companies were, trying to cost cut in the same way they were trying to use melamine, which is a sweetener, instead of the natural products, and these were causing problems for the babies who were ingesting the milk. And you look at how is China actually dealing with this problem, and a year ago they executed the Chinese head of the Food and Drug Safety Agency after a huge scandal, and a year later we have the same kinds of problems coming up, and on from the SARS and so on. It doesn't seem to be working itself out. And so you have this situation where there's this problem where the companies themselves are obviously performing badly, but the state is so invested in maintaining the idea that things are okay that it's suppressing the press around these kind of things. And this is the kind of the creaking timbers of the central state, which doesn't want to admit that the local operatives have got too much power. And so it keeps on carrying out cover-ups, it keeps on maintaining opacity, which is damaging for the people, it's damaging for the transparency, for the investment, and it's not the best way to build a framework for thriving businesses. And so this is a kind of interesting question, why is it that the state's holding on to so much power? And this is a Deng Xiaoping quote, from early in the reform era, which is particularly striking when you think about this. It says, if the economy cannot be boosted, over the long run we will lose people's support at home and be oppressed and bullied by other nations throughout the world. The continuation of such a situation will only lead to the collapse and disintegration of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's a really striking statement because, it's like the idea, we've got to boost the economy and we have to, become a stronger nation. Everybody's kind of aware of this idea that, that China wants to maximize its economy, it wants to gain superpower status. But the core reason that Deng Xiaoping outlines for this is not to improve conditions for workers or, to gain a seat at the UN. It's because this is the way to maintain the continuing existence of the Communist Party. And the need to maintain the existence of the Communist Party is tilting the whole economy in a bizarre way. And it's happening particularly in terms of the distribution of money. When we look at this graph shows the labor costs, which are rising, albeit slowly, and the Gini coefficient, which is rising much faster. And we see that, what's happening is that this cronyism, which is occurring with these top officials and these top developers who are siphoning off all of the money, and the government itself, which is siphoning off an enormous amount of money, whereas the people themselves are getting much less. And, a quick way of demonstrating this, the government reserves at the end of 2007 were about $1.7 trillion. It's over $1,000 for every person in China, which is just being kept by the government rather than being distributed. And so, well, what are the government actually spending money on? And this graph kind of, shows the basic way in which, okay, so the state is siphoning up huge amounts of money to cement its own position, but, what is it actually spending money on? And the things that really feature, if we look here, we see that the proportion of the global world product is 6%, and yet the percentage of cement consumption is 50%, the steel is 33%, the aluminium is 25%. It's all building cities, it's all investment in infrastructure. And so, the Chinese people themselves, they're not getting the money at the moment, and yet they're building all of these cities, and it's this terrifically future-orientated idea about the way in which things should be developed. There's a pig there as well. The 50% of pigs is interesting for many reasons, but I'm not going to go into it now. Anyway, so the point is that, it's this notion of like, there's a real future. Like everybody in China at the moment is getting the short end of the stick. They're not getting the money, the people in the West are getting the low inflation, the government's cooping it all up, but it's putting it into building these cities and it's constructing a new society. It's literally the construction of a new society. That's what the book's called, The Chinese Dream, a construction of a new society. It's building the future, and that's, the way in which things are supposed to be moving forwards for China. And, like, where is it actually going to go? And so, just to finish, the primary objective of the 2007 11th five-year plan, what was the headline thing that Hu Jintao specified was going to happen with, and it was about, a more harmonious society, better distribution of wealth. And they said, we're going to build a new socialist countryside. And I think that's something which is, it brings things around nicely from Neville's discussion of, what actually is happening in the countryside and the way in which urbanization is occurring across the countryside, how that's affecting urbanization. And so that rounds up what we have to say for this evening, I think.
Thank you, Adrian. So we've heard different perspectives. We've heard the urban planning perspective. We've heard the societal perspective, the economic perspective. I'd like to invite the members of the panel to come to the floor. And I'd like to open the discussion with a question for Adrian. Adrian, you mentioned that China is still very much export-oriented and that they're getting the bad end of the deal at the moment. What do you think will happen when they start properly catering to their internal market? Will that change the dynamics globally as well, since China is so... That'll be enough.
Are we on? Okay, so export levels in China are contributing much less. I mean, export is still very high. It's about 40% of GDP. But at the same time, then the consumer market, as I showed, it's growing very strongly and it's contributing much more to the growth of GDP. And so the importance for the Chinese to turn to their own market, the internal market is developing very rapidly, and that will be there. I think the challenge for China will be to actually to service its own internal market. At the moment, then the Chinese companies have got the lion's share of the cheap end of the goods, but then at the high-tech end, then Nokia is still the #1 phone provider, and many other people like that. And as the credit crunch comes in, and there'll be much more pressure, there'll be much more competition within China from foreign firms, and the need for the local Chinese brands to actually be able to develop more sophisticated mechanisms to compete, I think, will become increasingly important.
Just a quick follow-up question. Do you think this will contribute to the quality of the goods in China?
One would hope. One would hope. I mean, I think at some point, then, the extent to which Chinese consumers will continue to buy goods that they feel are potentially lethal is, it's not so high. Like if there are the Chinese baby milk powders and the foreign baby milk powders, and you can afford a foreign baby milk powder, you probably buy the foreign one at the moment.
I have a question for you as well, Adrian. Maybe a question I should have asked during the process of the book, but do you think China can sort of outconsume itself, and in that sense maybe survive its own predicament? Can it consume enough to keep the balance?
Oh yeah, I mean, it can certainly consume plenty. I mean, there are a lot of people there, and they're all hungry and want to move into new products. I don't think there's any...
Is there no gap? Is there no ceiling to this?
Well, I mean, the most obvious ceiling that people talk about is the fact that if China continues to grow in its oil consumption at current rates, then by 2030 it'll consume 6/5 of current world production. So that would be, if current world production were to increase by 20% and every other nation on Earth stopped using, then China would kind of be able to sustain its current oil growth, which obviously isn't going to happen. But then, everybody's working on different ways to think about different, being more efficient and using different energy sources. I don't see there being a necessary problem, but I think the political change is an aspect which definitely has to keep in step with the reforms. So far, the reforms with the economy and the way in which people work have come along quite far, but the political reforms haven't been in step.
What is the unemployment rate in China?
Sorry?
The unemployment rate as of now.
I think it's very low. In Shenzhen it was only 2%, but then again they're having trouble finding the right people, meaning finding cheap labor increasingly difficult.
Yeah, I think statistics are problematized by how exactly you define unemployment in the rural areas, which is still 60% of the population. And so, there's enormous levels of underemployment, but, they're not actually specifically drawing benefits, and there isn't a welfare system which gives you, unemployment in the West is usually calculated by how many people of working age are withdrawing unemployment benefit, which doesn't exist in China in the same way.
Yes, I was wondering about the geopolitical side of things, no? Like, because you have the American dream, but the American dream was always accompanied by sort of the arch enemy, like, would it be Russians, and now it's like the war against terrorism. So, because I'm very curious about how people in China think about this double bind between China and the US, no? The US being the main contender, but also being the main sort of consumer of Chinese products. So, how do people in China view this competitive and at the same time associative relationship with the US?
If I may, that's actually a question for you, Louis, because you addressed this issue in the book yourself.
Well, I addressed it from the point of view of energy, and obviously from an energy standpoint, the geopolitical aspects are evident, most notably because oil can only be acquired from certain places in the world, and Saudi Arabia became one of China's main trade countries for oil, and Sudan, for instance, which has a very shady human rights record. China is very much implanted in Sudan as well, has a collaborative relation the Sudanese. And this goes on, not only for oil, but other resources. So the fact that there's a geopolitical dimension to this is obvious. And I think it's not simply a matter of resources, but also an economic alongside the geopolitical dimension is the economic dimension, because as you mentioned, the United States has is a contender, but also an associate, because it buys Chinese goods. So this is a very complex question. I don't think that we can answer it here with this panel. It's probably the most pressing question, maybe one of the most pressing questions at the moment. I think it's beyond my scope, certainly. Perhaps Adrian would like to add a little bit more about it.
No, I just wanted to add that on a day-to-day, everyday experience level, nationalism is one of the myth that's being propagated right now by the Chinese government as well. But the main opponent is not the US, but it's Japan. So many, I don't know, most Americans or most Chinese people are much more thinking of Japan than as America, I think, as their main contender or enemy, or I don't know if you even want to frame it like that. But you see that nationalism is really on the rise, and again in this also this shift. For example, I think it's Jasper Becker who gives this example in the book, one of the books about China he wrote. He said that up until the 70s, when you walked into a Chinese school, for example, you would see portraits of famous communists. You'd see Mark, Lenin, Trotsky. But now they have gone, and now there are famous Chinese people hanging there. Like an inventor from the 14th century or so. So at all sorts of levels, there is a stress from we're all communists to we are all Chinese.
Yeah, there's actually, I'd like to add a short story to that about, it's very complicated. And there was one time in particular, I remember us having lunch with a Chinese friend called Carol, and she went on a nationalistic rant about how America was a land of no culture, and they were so disgusting, and they were invading Iraq, and how they had no culture, and you kept on going on and on about how there was no such thing as American culture, and that it was a sort of spiritually hollow land as opposed to China, which was very rich. And I was going to say, how can you say that, Carol? Say that American music, American fashion has influenced you so much. Never, nothing that's come out of America has influenced me. And I pointed out to her that she was wearing a pair of kind of like US-style khaki combat pants, which actually had a Stars and Stripes flag on the belt. And, when she, I said, right there, you're wearing an American flag. And she's like, I didn't see that. I, swore that she would never wear the pants again and was going to tear it off. But, that kind of level of sort of conflict that the Chinese have about, their great pride in nationalism, how they're becoming a global power again, and the dislike of America in relation to that, and also Japan, but also the need for, the joy with which they are getting into consumer lifestyles, and how it's associated with American dreams.
There's actually a big discussion going on right now in the blogosphere, which was initiated by, I think, a magazine in Guangzhou that interviewed some people, and the questions were, what have you done for your country, and what has your country done for you? And then a lot of bloggers picked up that theme, and they started to write about from their own perspective. And quite a few bloggers, they pointed out, because I think in Chinese the word for country and government is more or less the same. If I'm right, but something was double. And then they started to pull these terms apart. They said, I'm very proud to be a Chinese because we have all these customs from a long time ago, and we have the characters and the calligraphy, and we have all these traditions. And then we have the state. But about the state, I'm not really that proud, or that I don't feel attached or loyal to it, but I feel loyal to the Chinese culture itself, which is maybe a different sort of nationalism, I don't know, that's being developed right now. Because I guess people are getting, because of the milk scandal and all the scandals, people are getting more and more wary about the state not being able to secure them in very important and lethal areas as well.
Okay, more questions from the audience?
Probably a question for Martijn. Do you think that this Chinese dream is essentially Chinese in a way that it's different from the American pursuit of happiness? or can you define something else than just wishing a car, home, and a family?
Yeah, the question is in what way is a Chinese dream really different from the American dream in its essence? And I think, again, it's in what I just mentioned, that this idea of being Chinese for the Chinese people is very important. And for, I think for a large part, but maybe you can add on, that is, being found in all the details of life that are very much important for them, and that they won't do away with them, even though they're building brand new cities. They're proud of their national festivals, of their characters, of the poems from the Tang dynasty, and all that. So I think there is a very important Chinese cultural component of which people are very proud in that dream. I don't know, what is your
I don't know, well, I think there are, it's important to note that to some extent the Chinese dream of, a home and a family, I don't think it's fair to say that's a derivative of the American dream. I think that's a fairly common to humanity notion of what would be a nice thing for somebody to aspire to. And in relation to the notion of consumerism, and that home is not exclusively a suburban dream. I think there are, we did a survey in which there are a lot of people who said they'd be very happy to live in towers in modern environments and so on. It's not necessarily a suburban thing, and a car is just a status thing. It could be something else in another 10 years. But in terms of the notion of moving towards a consumerist dream, I think it's potentially a really profound thing. And there's, in the course of history so far, cultures have, they've gone through political change, and they've gone through different types of religions, and there's been, cultures have gone back and forth from one regime to another, but there's no precedent so far for people to kind of get into consumerism and then revert or kind of walk back out of it. I mean, there's sort of like little hippie communities, but generally, once consumerism takes a hold of a people, then it, they stick with it so far.
Neville, I've got a question for you, actually. As I said to Martijn, I had a sharp reaction on leaving China 4 years ago, not only with regards to the consumerist patterns that were emerging, but also the way that they were building, which I found very oppressive in a way, and not at all amenable to what I would think the way society should live in an urban setting. How has it progressed since then? Is it going in the right direction or not?
Well, it depends, like Martijn said, who you ask. I think they're increasingly good at selling the dream, be it in a sort of early stage through visualizing it in movies and such. But also they're quite good at creating the dream in a very flash, kind of plastic version, which helps developers to carve out an ever larger group of consumers, of homeowners. Actually, they can target homeowners that you almost want to suggest with their level of prosperity, they really shouldn't yet be able to make the move from the dormitory walk-ups of the communist era to these new fancy buildings, because it means that the quality of the buildings is reduced to very, very little, and you can't really experience it as you're walking in, but maybe 2 days down the road it becomes apparent. More importantly, there is a problem emerging that is, what is the product of all these buildings put together? What is the quality of the city as a whole? This is something that you can't really put your finger on. It's very hard to measure, especially for a layman just using the city, if your city is well designed or not. You can experience congestion, but that means that maybe there's not enough roads. Unfortunately, obviously, that's the opposite. So all these buildings put together are, in my opinion, creating cities that are increasingly removed from designed environments in terms of environments that try to serve a large group of people in an urban system. So it looks nice on a cellular level, but maybe it's becoming increasingly problematic on a citywide level.
And in terms of the overall urban planning, is it still occurring as organically as it did then, or have they moved towards more central planning dynamics?
There is, and I noticed today, and it's very painful. The whole situation is one big hybrid, and I think that's maybe one of the themes running through all the presentations. There's no black and white. It's very much a muddled condition. But what's going on, I think, on a planning level, is that China has been very effective in implementing a sort of stepping stone, top-down approach, where the idea is you create these mega projects, being at the Olympics or a new CBD, etc., that should somehow spill off over to the rest of the city and create a better city. It's an approach that is very controllable. You can define an area very clearly, which helps you to attract developers and particularly investors fairly easily. It's well delineated. However, it kind of flies into the face of planning, which is all about creating networks and connecting areas. It's becoming sort of a series of moments. Hopefully, post-Olympic China is about trying to make room for the desires and the individual demands at grassroots level, at a user level, and somehow bring these two together.
Maybe a follow-up question. What you just described about like how this urbanism works in China, to me it sounds totally like urbanism is working in Europe today. So I mean, we're totally away from centralist planning. We like Rotterdam Station area. We just take a landmark area. We develop that in a very close connection between the government and developers, and you try to make this centralized zone, which somehow is supposed to raise the whole city to a higher level. So how can we expect it to the Chinese any better? So
that's a really good point. Let me quickly comment on that. One of the reasons we did the project in the first place was because China is such a great case study. It just exemplifies this commercial form of urbanization which is happening across the globe. So it's not just about China, it's about new trends of urbanization.
I'd like to add a thing. I'm doing research at the moment about planologically, like city building in the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands we're used to living, you don't have a lot of space, so you have to do it with less living space, but instead of the living space we do have a lot of mental space, like the freedom of mind. And I think that is a really big difference between how it is for me, how I think it's here. Here we have more freedom in mind, like it's more individualistic and universalistic view, and not from collectivism. So it's really hard to describe in really a few sentences. So I'm really actually curious how in the future the extreme city planning will develop in China because of the background difference in the mental way of dealing with problems. It's not only the system you talked about earlier, it also has to do a lot of, that's part of how you deal with the problem of the city planning as well.
I thought at first maybe this is a question for Martijn, but I can say something about it. And it also relates, it's maybe a better answer to your previous question as well, Louis. Like, as you are building these really clean, crisp, sort of really well articulated moments, it's becoming organic as things continue to expand. What I understand from your question is somehow the notion of being part of the process. But we mentioned a little bit about the end user, the consumer, initially not being part of the process of the design, but hopefully, ultimately, being part of the process through its wallet by kind of participating because it's joining forces and fighting for its rights on a building level, etc. But that still leaves out one group, the designer. There's a classic quote from a project on the city by Harvard, which states something like, the Chinese architect is 500 times more efficient than its American counterpart. Sure, that's probably true. At the same time, now working in reality, trying to realize projects in China, I've noticed the Chinese designer is 500 times less in control and less part of the real final product than maybe an architect in the West. So developers and government alike are using the fourth party, the designers, pretty much as draftsmen. It's very cynical and dry, and things are changing. Nothing is black and white. But by and large, this is still the case. So until that changes, your sort of mental space is hard to implement in the Chinese cities.
I think I'd just like to add on that. I think we have to be somewhat careful about such things. I mean, I think if you suggested to Chinese people that they have less mental space than people in the West, they'd probably object pretty vociferously. And it's worth mentioning that Chinese cities and the whole of Chinese society is in a state of tremendous flux, and one of the results of that is, in some ways, it's very free. Like, things change so fast, and you don't know what's going to happen. You can imagine much more far-out things than most people in Rotterdam or London could ever do. Like, we've essentially in the West come to a fairly conservative, threatened society in which we're sort of trying to hold on to what we've got, and we're worried about other powers taking over and so on. I don't think we've got the same mental freedoms in terms of fluidity about thinking of ourselves and our society that people do in China.
For me, China has so many layers. It has, if you come from Beijing, like you see the CCTV or stadium, it's almost like the first world. But if you drive 400 kilometers away from Beijing, it's another third world. And the PUC, Neville Mars, the concept of PUC, Neville Mars race, I think is very interesting because you divide China to one zone and the other zone. But maybe within this PUC, you can divide the PUC to another lot of layers, like big cities, secondary cities, city area, countryside. So when you talk about China dream, I see it most of the case you talk about dream of people living in the city. So my question or my comments is, do you take into consideration how people in the countryside, farmers, the 60% of Chinese population, what do they think? What's their dream? There are so many levels of Chinese dream, let's say the national dream, the middle class dream, maybe they are total 10% of total population, and the dream of the farmers, they're so different.
Maybe I can rephrase the question and then put it to Martijn, because I think there's an interesting topic there, which is that, as I mentioned, urbanization is happening by and large outside of the cities, below the radar. You can extrapolate that and suggest there's actually an entirely new continent being built, being shaped, forming naturally, organically, within the rural environment. And I wouldn't suggest really thinking about zoning because it's so muddled. Now, that could mean there is a brave new world there, which we haven't seen yet, and people are now trying to address with the socialist village and such. I think quite a scary prospect. So it could be something that offers a lot of potential for a response to the problems, or maybe it generates a whole new, very dangerous environment where city and this urbanized countryside are even more opposing than they've ever been before. So what I have done the last 5 years is sort of pose questions, and this is one of the key ones. Maybe you can suggest a scenario.
No, well, first, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, of course, it's a bit ridiculous to talk about the Chinese dream as if 1.2 billion people would all have the same dream. And China is a very complex and layered country, and a whole continent in itself. I don't know. The way we used it here was to try to get a grasp on something that's being put forward in China. I mean, there is this new mythology that's being developed, and that's being you see it on TV, in the propaganda, in the newspapers, in music videos, in exercise videos on TV, etc., etc. And of course, not everybody buys into that. Not everybody shares it, but it does, in some way, land even in the country, for better or for worse. I mean, some of the villages, some of the photos that I showed you were made in Suining, which is a very new village. I think up until the early 80s, it was still countryside, and then it was turned into a village and started urbanizing. But because this mythology is there, the leaders of the local city, they feel that they too have to comply with this new official myth, and they start developing. I showed you the little clip. This high-tech zone that they want to build in the middle of nowhere, and it's a little bit strange, because if you look at the city, if you look at the animation I showed you, then there was the river, and then here was the new city, and here it was completely blank. But that's where the old city was. I mean, they totally neglected it, and they just wanted to start anew with this new myth of the urban dream, and they had no interest at all in the dreams of the people who already live there. So you're absolutely right, and that's probably what your question came down to as well. I mean, the middle class is really small considered to all the other people that are there. Yet, for some reason, this mythology is somehow, in some parts, leading in the way the country is being developed. But I think it's good to be critical of that. I mean, we're not here to embrace that, saying that every Chinese should have this dream, but we're naming it so we can try to understand what's happening.
No. Isn't the whole point that the middle class would grow? I mean, isn't the middle class, isn't it growing?
Well, that's definitely, ultimately that is the goal for everybody. This issue is related to what does that mean spatially and what does it mean socially. Are there maybe a rural and an urban middle class? Today, there's still the hukou system is still in place. The urban legislation is still in place. You're still either very much a rural citizen or an urban citizen. And sure, these policies are slowly being tweaked, but it's still in place. That's a very harsh divide where spatially it's completely muddled. I think that's the real issue.
I get the impression that China is ignoring or forgetting the history of China. Is it true, and why is it? Because in other parts of the world, people are proud of history and are learning from history.
Well, recent history has been rather painful, so it's not that it actually
there's
has
more
been,
than recent history.
If you look at the Olympics, the opening ceremony has been a total glorification of Chinese long outstanding history, its inventions, etc. It's globalization, taking over Africa, which is doing again today. So it loves its history, and it's rooting a lot of nationalism on this history. It's just these last few decades that have been a little bit itchy.
Yeah, there's a very explicit policy from the, well, not explicit as in they'd say it out loud, but it's very clear that the Chinese Communist Party recently has, it has a sort of, an identity crisis in that it's not really a communist party anymore. And so, how does it continue to affirm its legitimacy? And one of the ways it's done that is to try and tack itself onto the historical feudal China, and has reused a lot of Confucian rhetoric, and has brought out a lot of ancient things, particularly the Beijing ceremony, but generally then there's been a big push for nationalism and Chineseness as the historical idea of Chineseness as opposed to the recent history, and trying to associate historical powerful China with the current Communist Party as opposed to the last 2 decades where China's thought of itself as the sick man of Asia, which obviously it's trying to shrug off as an identity. And so yeah, there's a lot of kind of people plundering history for national identity, which I think is a process which nations generally do across the world, and as they develop, I think that relationship with history is quite strong.
And what was very nice in Martijn's presentation was that to fill that gap, that blank, running from 1949, it's recreating sort of this instant history, being in fake facades and Eurostyle, but also just creating moments, a moment where you're sending somebody into space, sort of clinging on to an instant history. I think we have one more, right?
We have one more pressing question from the audience.
Alex.
Yes, maybe it's not a pressing question, but it's a question, and it relates a little bit to this, how do you call it, this somehow unavoidable comparisons that comes up with the Reconstruction period in Europe after the Second World War, getting into, how do you call it, this consumer ideal, this family ideal, and then at the end, of course, what you see that in the 60s, there was a very strong counter-movement coming up, mainly from students. Actually, if you look to the history of China, there has always been two very strong revolutionary forces. One was the countryside, the farmers, which I thought was the, how do you call it, the motivation for coming up with the 400 cities because of the unemployment. And the other thing is that what's happening at the universities. So tonight, nothing from universities or students came up, but I would be interested if you did interviews and listened to students in how they were looking at the future of China, since, how do you call it, what they represent in the history of China.
Yeah, I've talked with quite a few students, and most of them were actually embracing all the developments. They didn't want to go into a counterculture or critique what was happening. They were but of course not all of them. I mean, you can't talk for everybody, but in general, most of those I talked to, they were eager to be part of this movement, this historic movement where they built up the country, and they were becoming even members of the Communist Party. Because it's a good place to network, and it's good for your career. So that's one side. On the other side, of course, in the big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, of course, there is a lot of criticism, and I mentioned this before in your question, especially in the arts. You see a lot of criticism about the fast-paced urbanism or the rule of the migrants, and there is somewhat of a small counterculture, I guess. I don't know.
They could
to say, actually in your work, Martijn, I always found a really sort of positive, large, strong body of people engaging with counterculture, especially using new media. They were critical, sharp, aware of things, which is very difficult when you have little information. But then again, in absolute terms, that is nothing. It's completely, you know, you can almost say it's absent. But they're becoming so prominent, and they're seeding a new way of talking and thinking that it's also hopeful. And we had a lot of discussions which side almost is going to be predominant. I have to say, which is maybe is interesting, the last 2 months I'm seeing moments, we heard moments about things about the milk. I'm seeing these in Chinese media where I really find there's a distinct difference now in the last 2-3 months where it's being allowed to seep through the regular media as well. You're getting these stories on TV, you're getting more critical notes. So I'm actually recently very optimistic about this.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to end with a final question to all three of you, to the extent that you can answer it. Do you like living in China? And why or why not? Neville, you first.
I need some time to think about that.
Okay, Adrian, you first.
Well, I think it's, you know, there's a somewhat evident bias in that Neville actually lives in China and Martijn and I do not. So on a base truth, in terms of, you know, judging ourselves by our behavior, then it's yes, no, no as we go across, I think.
Well, the interesting thing is I've never lived in China, and the longest I've been there was 2 months, I think, in a row. But I always have this strange feeling when I come back from China. I always feel energized. I come back in Amsterdam and I have this enormous sense of energy because you're there and everybody's upbeat and doing things, and you come back to Amsterdam and, you know, you get back into the complaining columns and the newspapers, and people are looking more backwards than forwards, and for some reason I think, you know, well, oh, I wish I could go back again. But then when I do a reality check, I think, you know, wow, but, you know, quality of life is so much better here. I can breathe. I mean, there is a film festival like every week. I can go to the theater. You know, healthcare is so much better. My milk powder is okay. So China feels so much energizing to be there. But of course, if you're there for a short time, it's easier to, you know, get sucked into that moment than when you really have to deal with bureaucracy or you know, the real world, when you're not just there to do some interviews, talk with some people, take some funny pictures, and go back again. But that's my sense.
Neville, the real world.
Well, the luxury of being able to travel really makes that my answer is exactly the opposite. I am really energized when I can do something like this, an event like this. And then when I come back to China, I'm ready to face the daily realities again. Daily realities that feed me with problems to try and think about. But you have to come back every now and then.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists, and thank you for coming. The bar is over there, the book is over there. Have a drink, have a look, and thank you for coming.
There is something we didn't communicate with you, but you probably noticed it already, that there was a presentation of Crimson Architects planned, but there was family matter, illness, so they couldn't make it. So that's why all of a sudden the evening is also over. I would like to thank the speakers for tonight and the moderator. I think it was an interesting insight in, how to call it, a long-term investment we're doing in setting up exchanges with Chinese curators, artists, architects from China and Europe, the Netherlands in this case also. And I would like to thank the technical team who has been streaming everything tonight. So if you missed something or you want to look back something, go to the website. There is a stream that you can look up, or send the email of the URL to friends that you think should have a look. Thanks to the team, and enjoy yourself tonight.